Tonight we dive into a subject that's a bit of a historical roller coaster. Sex in the Victorian era. You might be thinking, what could possibly be so terrifying about a time when everything seemed so proper? But trust me, you probably won't survive this reality check. The Victorians lived under a stringent moral code. If you think modern-day censorship is intense, try living in an era where the word sex could send people into a cold sweat. In the midst of a growing empire, lavish wealth, and a seemingly perfect social structure, sexuality was tucked away in the shadows. But unlike today, where sexual freedom and open discussions are making strides, albeit with some hurdles, the Victorians were living in a world of strict repression and relentless shame. Imagine this. You've just woken up in your small, dimly lit bedroom. The air smells faintly of incense as you walk into a house carefully designed to maintain decency, fancy wallpaper, strict decorum, and a constant underlying tension. The sense that every movement you make is being scrutinized, as if even a glance might give away your deepest thoughts and desires. Walking outside, the streets are buzzing with gossip. Women in corsets, men in top hats, all marching to the beat of social expectation. Every time a lady passed by, you knew her life had been dictated by one goal: to maintain her purity. Sex in the Victorian era wasn't a private matter. It was a social construct. Every action, every gesture had its place and its judgment. Society created an idea of appropriate sexuality, teaching everyone what was acceptable and what wasn't, and more importantly, it enforced silence. When discussing intimacy or even the thought of sexual desire, the Victorians were like an empire of silence, where not even the whisper of affection could be heard unless it adhered to strict societal codes. For women, this silence was suffocating. They were raised with one mission in mind: to embody virtue. Sexuality wasn't discussed, it wasn't acknowledged, and it certainly wasn't celebrated. Women were encouraged to see themselves as pure, untouched by the corrupting influences of desire. It wasn't about the possibility of pleasure, but about the risk of becoming a woman seen as loose or improper. A woman was expected to not feel desire, at least not outwardly. She wasn't allowed to express herself beyond the confines of what was socially appropriate. Her body wasn't her own. It was a possession, first of her father and then of her husband. The concept of female purity was a cornerstone of Victorian social norms. To stray from this ideal could mean a complete fall from grace. A woman who was thought to have desires outside the marriage bed faced social exile, harsh judgment, and possible punishment. But beneath this idealization of purity, there was something darker. A contradictory underbelly that many ignored or tried to suppress. The reality was that Victorian society was rife with illicit sexual behavior, especially among the men. The double standards were staggering. While men could indulge in their desires, women were expected to repress theirs. As society continued to revere chastity, something else grew in its shadows: prostitution. Despite the ideal of modesty and purity, the demand for sexual pleasure did not disappear, it merely went underground. Prostitution became an accepted vice of the time. Women who had fallen from society's grace or who were born into poverty often had no choice but to turn to sex work. In fact, the existence of prostitutes became part of the Victorian sexual landscape, making the notion of chastity even more of a facade. For the men in this world, sex was something that could be experienced without the same moral judgment or restriction. As much as we may look back and cringe at the lack of education or sexual freedom, the truth is that the Victorians knew a lot less about their bodies than we do now. The concept of sex education didn't exist in the way we understand it today. Sex, pleasure, and reproduction were not openly discussed, except in private or through medical texts that tended to pathologize and shame any form of sexual desire. Women were told nothing about their anatomy or sexual health. The truth about human bodies and natural functions was kept in the dark, leaving many to fear the unknown. In fact, there were entire books dedicated to curing masturbation, which was viewed as a sinful, dangerous act. For men, the sexual pressure wasn't as intense, though their role was still marred by complex expectations. On one hand, men were encouraged to express virility, strength, and power. Sex was part of their identity as men. However, this came with expectations to keep emotions out of their sexual relationships. Men were expected to be sexually dominant and distant. Sexual affection was something to be shown rarely, and marriage itself was less about emotional connection and more about economic and social positioning. When it came to intimacy, men were largely expected to control their emotions and desires. And yet, for all their supposed sexual freedom, many men had no more guidance on emotional intimacy than women did on their own sexual health. Victorian sex was also deeply tied to reproduction. To have sex was to fulfill a moral and biological duty, to provide heirs for the future. This pragmatic view of sex as an act of procreation rather than pleasure became a dominant cultural belief. And yet, in the midst of this deeply controlled environment, a darker truth was lurking. The desire for pleasure didn't just disappear, it found its way into hidden corners, whether in the form of illicit affairs, prostitutes, or even the sexual fantasies that flourished behind the scenes. The Victorian era's approach to sexuality was built on this complicated, often hypocritical balance of desire, repression, and control. The most terrifying reality, though, wasn't just the physical control, it was the way in which these sexual taboos and restrictions bled into every part of social life. It wasn't just about sex, it was about power, social status, and the delicate balance of human relationships in a world that feared the body's natural instinct. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below about where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I'd love to know how far this journey goes tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now that we've touched upon the restrictive nature of the Victorian society, let's dive deeper into how sex wasn't just about pleasure or love, it was about power, status, and control. Sex and sexuality during this period were tightly bound to the roles people were expected to play in society. In this world, sexuality wasn't just a private matter between two people. It was a public declaration of your place in the social hierarchy. The Victorian era's obsession with sexual propriety was rooted in its broader concern with public morality. For the wealthy and the elite, a person's sexual conduct was an extension of their social status. To be sexually proper meant you were socially respectable, especially for women. It wasn't just about maintaining decorum, it was a form of personal and family branding. Being seen as sexually pure was, in many ways, the only way to ensure a respectable reputation. Women who maintained this purity were seen as valuable assets, upholding the honor of their families. But for men, sexual conduct was a bit more complicated. Men were expected to remain emotionally distant, which made it difficult to form real intimacy with their wives. Their roles as husbands were mostly about ensuring their wives were properly controlled and that they produced heirs for the family. Men, meanwhile, had more freedom in terms of sexual exploration. Society granted them more leeway when it came to satisfying their desires. However, this freedom came with its own set of rules. If a man strayed too far outside his role as a provider, he was seen as reckless. Despite the supposed freedom, men too were caught in a web of rigid social rules and constraints. You might be surprised to learn that in the Victorian world, sex had little to do with the emotions that we today link to intimacy. In fact, many believed that love had no place in sex. It was simply about fulfilling your marital duty. The idea of romantic love was still a new concept, often seen as secondary to the primary roles of procreation and social conformity. For women, sex was often viewed as a painful necessity, something to endure for the sake of family and husband. Many Victorians believed that women could not even enjoy sex, and that their primary role was to submit passively. To acknowledge otherwise would be scandalous and immoral. While this strict social order sought to control sexual expression, it also created a subculture of secrecy. Sex became a hidden thing, a dark, illicit subject to be avoided at all costs in polite society. Yet, despite all the repression, the reality was that sexual desires couldn't be erased. They couldn't be swept under the rug. There were cracks in the social facade, where some people would find secret ways to indulge their needs. For women, this meant prostitution, which was rampant across the Victorian world. Though the elite tried to maintain the illusion of respectability, the reality was that many men had frequent visits to brothels. Historians still argue about whether prostitution was more a product of Victorian hypocrisy or simply a pragmatic solution to the sexual needs that were kept suppressed. What is clear, though, is that this contradiction created a dangerous world where the bodies of women were commodified. Prostitutes, many of whom had no other choice, were seen as moral outcasts. Yet, in a strange paradox, they were also part of the world that men could freely access, despite the moral outrage that came with it. Sexual repression wasn't confined to the realm of the lower classes, though. Among the upper echelons of society, the reality was no less complex. The Victorian elites maintained a strict moral code that prevented open displays of affection or desire. Even the very act of sexual intercourse was reduced to a clinical, almost mechanical act within the confines of marriage. It wasn't about intimacy, connection, or love. It was about control. There was a perception that a marriage, and by extension sex, was a contract, not a romantic bond. The idea of marital passion was often dismissed as a triviality, only to be replaced by the notion of duty. For men in the Victorian court, sexual manipulation and power dynamics took on a much more complex dimension. The king's desires were often seen as part of the political machine, with concubines, both male and female, holding positions that extended beyond the bedroom. In some cases, concubines were expected to form political alliances through their sexual relationships. The notion of sex being a symbol of status and wealth was not just a superficial expectation. It had a real impact on the power structures of the time. The silence surrounding sex created a breeding ground for fear and misunderstanding. While men were allowed to indulge in their sexual desires, there were constant fears about the dangers of pleasure. For both men and women, sexual knowledge was almost always partial and often distorted. Discussions of sexual health were minimal, and what little information was available was often filled with shame or moral judgment. Even basic knowledge of human anatomy was treated as forbidden. In fact, for women, any exploration of their own desires was considered immoral, and they were discouraged from acknowledging their own sexual needs. The fear surrounding sexuality wasn't just social, it was medical too. Doctors and medical experts often classified sexual behavior outside of traditional norms as pathological. For example, masturbation was viewed as a dangerous affliction, something that could cause severe physical and mental harm. This fear of sexual indulgence led to numerous so-called treatments, from diet restrictions to bizarre procedures like genital surgery, in an attempt to curb desire. As much as the medical establishment sought to repress natural sexuality, there were also those who quietly worked behind the scenes to help people manage their desires. These were the early sexologists, who began to question the moral judgment placed on sexual pleasure. However, their voices were often drowned out by the louder voices of those enforcing sexual repression. The idea of sexual health was a new one, and it was only during the latter part of the Victorian era that a more balanced approach to sexuality began to take shape. In the private spheres of life, sexual repression was a central force in shaping the behavior of many Victorians. The moral codes of the time dictated everything, from the way couples interacted with each other, to how women were expected to remain virginal until marriage. Men too were expected to adhere to strict codes of conduct, limiting their relationships to duty rather than desire. This widespread fear of sexual transgression created a world where secrecy, guilt, and shame ruled. And yet, in the shadows of this rigid sexual code, something even darker emerged. The fear and control surrounding sexuality didn't just keep things hidden, it also bred a desire for the forbidden. People began to crave the very things they were told to avoid, pushing them further into secrecy. Some tried to escape the intense pressure by indulging in illicit affairs or visiting brothels, while others took part in underground movements to challenge these sexual norms. The Victorian approach to sex was a complex web of contradictions. On one hand, it preached purity, restraint, and duty. On the other, it bred secrecy, fear, and a deeper yearning for the forbidden. The overwhelming moral pressure left many with little space to explore their own desires or seek out genuine affection. In the end, the rigidity of the Victorian world created a dangerous game of control, one where many played their parts, but few truly understood the cost of the roles they were asked to perform. As the Victorians continued to build a world based on sexual repression, it wasn't just women who faced the brunt of this controlled society. Men, too, were caught in a paradoxical web where power, duty, and sexuality collided. Their sexual freedom was as strictly monitored as women's, albeit in different ways. They were expected to adhere to a code of conduct that prevented them from truly expressing their desires or emotions. In a sense, both men and women were trapped in their roles, where any deviation from the norm threatened to shatter the delicate balance of Victorian society. For men, sexual desire was always framed as something to be conquered and controlled. The Victorian ideal of masculinity demanded men to be stoic, reserved, and in full control of their emotions and actions. Sexual intimacy in this context was seen as a duty. Marriage was not about love or romance. It was about maintaining a lineage and securing the family's future. The emotional side of marriage was secondary, and men were not encouraged to connect with their wives on an emotional or sexual level. Instead, they were expected to perform their role as a husband and father. The problem, however, was that the body, as much as society tried to control it, remained a source of tension and frustration. The fear of male desire being unchecked led to extreme social control. Despite these strictures, men were still expected to prove their virility, often with the pressure to father children and maintain a strong bloodline. This conflicting dynamic created an environment where men were constantly at war with themselves. They were pushed to both indulge their desires in secret and suppress them in public. The rise of the male concubine in certain royal courts is an excellent example of how men, too, played a game of survival in the world of Victorian sexual politics. The Victorian era saw the rise of scientific explanations for sexual behavior, and this applied to both sexes. Doctors and physicians were seen as the authorities on sexual health, and they took it upon themselves to classify various sexual behaviors, many of which were deemed abnormal or dangerous. While many aspects of the medical profession aimed to help people understand their bodies, much of the science of the day was based on controlling human desires. Masturbation, for example, was pathologized, and many medical professionals believed it led to physical and mental health problems. Treatments, some of which were horrifying by modern standards, were employed to stop this evil habit. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely believed in these medical ideologies, or if they were simply tools for maintaining social control. What's clear is that the Victorians were deeply invested in regulating sexual behavior and the body. The medical field became a powerful agent in this process, with doctors working not just as healers, but also as moral enforcers. They prescribed treatments for what were seen as sexual disorders, which often ranged from rather benign behaviors to more severe conditions. Physicians' growing interest in sexuality, combined with a moralistic approach, reinforced the strict boundaries of what was considered normal sexual behavior. As the Victorians worked to define and confine sex to socially acceptable norms, they also created a world where people were forced to live in secrecy and guilt. These strict boundaries made it nearly impossible to have open conversations about sexuality, furthering the divide between desire and social propriety. People began to see their bodies as not just vessels for reproduction, but as sources of shame and fear. The body was no longer a place for exploration or pleasure. It became a battleground for control, both for the individual and society as a whole. Men's sexual desires were also subject to intense scrutiny. If they were seen as indulging too much in these desires, they risked losing their social standing and reputation. This was especially true for those in the upper classes, who had to maintain a facade of restraint and respectability. The contradictions were maddening. On one hand, men were encouraged to be sexually dominant and virile, but on the other, they were punished for showing any outward signs of sexual indulgence or passion. Sexuality became a private matter, with the few who could afford it secretly enjoying affairs outside the marriage bed, while the majority of men were left to navigate a world that demanded restraint and discipline. This societal pressure was particularly evident when it came to the role of concubines in the royal courts. The male concubine, often seen as a symbol of the king's wealth and power, was both a symbol of virility and a pawn in a dangerous game of politics. These men were treated as valuable commodities, sometimes used for sexual pleasure, other times as political instruments in the struggle for royal favor. This dual role complicated the already volatile world of royal courts, where the game of power and sex was being played at a high-stakes level. These concubines weren't simply lovers. They were subjects of manipulation, political maneuvering, and intrigue. For the men who became concubines, the world they entered was both luxurious and perilous. They were given the best of everything: fine foods, lavish clothing, and beautiful surroundings. But with all of this came the constant pressure to maintain their position in the court, where one wrong move could mean their fall from favor, or worse, their demise. The king's whims dictated their lives, and they were forced to navigate a web of power, manipulation, and deceit that governed the royal court. For these men, survival depended on their ability to stay in the king's favor, while also managing the intricate politics of the court. Historians still argue over the extent to which concubines held power in the royal courts. Some argue that they were simply pawns, powerless in the face of the king's ever-changing desires. Others suggest that they played a more strategic role, using their position to influence decisions and rise to power. What is clear, however, is that these men were not just sexual objects. They were players in a game where power was constantly shifting, and survival depended on knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to assert one's influence. At the heart of the Victorian obsession with sexual control was the larger social structure in which sex and power were inextricably linked. This system dictated who could express desires and who could not. For men, sex was a commodity, something that could be bought, sold, or exchanged. They could have their desires fulfilled, but it often came with a price. For women, it was even more complicated. Their desires were never acknowledged or respected. Instead, they were expected to live up to a completely unrealistic and damaging ideal of purity and chastity. As we move forward, we'll see how these dynamics play out in the daily lives of Victorians, how sexual repression, fear, and shame affected relationships, created barriers to intimacy, and fueled a hidden world of illicit sexual behavior. But perhaps the most disturbing reality is how this repression influenced the way people viewed themselves and their bodies. Sexuality, which should have been a natural and healthy expression of human connection, became instead a dangerous and shameful thing, and it was in this space where sex, power, and control collided that the Victorians lived out their private and often painful realities. As we continue our journey through the terrifying realities of sex in the Victorian era, it's important to understand the psychological impact this rigid sexual code had on the people who lived under it. This world of repression and strict moral guidelines was not only a social construct, but a deeply ingrained belief system that shaped how Victorians viewed themselves and their desires. They didn't just fear breaking the rules, they feared the consequences of even acknowledging their desires, let alone acting on them. The result was a culture of guilt, shame, and emotional turmoil that affected not only the way people expressed their sexuality, but how they formed intimate connections. The Victorian era's obsession with control meant that even the most basic aspects of human desire were treated with suspicion. For women, this was particularly devastating. From a young age, girls were taught that their sexuality was something to be hidden, repressed, and ignored. They were raised to see their bodies as dangerous, something to be ashamed of, rather than embraced. In contrast, men were expected to be the sexual aggressors. Yet, even they faced restrictions on how they could express their desires. The contradiction was suffocating for both genders. For men, there was a social expectation to be sexually dominant, but there was also a looming pressure to maintain emotional distance and avoid expressing any sign of emotional vulnerability. Victorians did everything they could to ensure that sex was a private, isolated experience. Public displays of affection were considered vulgar and inappropriate. In fact, even the mere mention of sexual desire in public could bring shame upon an individual and their family. Men and women were expected to keep their passions in check, and any deviation from this norm was seen as scandalous. Yet, despite the obsessive desire to control sexuality, something darker was unfolding behind closed doors. Many Victorians, both male and female, were secretly engaging in behavior that contradicted everything their society told them was acceptable. Prostitution, for example, was not only widespread but largely ignored by the upper echelons of society. While respectable men were expected to maintain a facade of monogamous marriage, they often frequented brothels or had extramarital affairs. For women, this kind of behavior was seen as the ultimate betrayal, and many were ostracized if they were caught. The hypocrisy of the era was evident. Sex was tightly controlled and repressed, yet it existed in a secret, underground world of indulgence. At the same time, the medical community played an active role in shaping sexual attitudes. The Victorians were obsessed with regulating human bodies and behaviors, and their views on sexuality were no exception. The medical profession became a key player in reinforcing the idea that certain sexual behaviors were immoral and dangerous. In fact, it was doctors and physicians who helped perpetuate many of the myths surrounding sex and sexuality during this period. One of the most damaging ideas put forward by the medical community was the concept of female hysteria. Physicians believed that women's sexual desire was a form of illness, and the solution was often to perform painful and invasive treatments, including manual stimulation, to cure them. This view was not only patronizing, but also deeply harmful, as it placed the responsibility for women's sexuality squarely on the shoulders of male doctors, who controlled women's bodies under the guise of treatment. Masturbation was another taboo subject during this time, particularly for men. For much of the Victorian era, masturbation was believed to be a morally corrupt, physically damaging act. Doctors claimed that it caused everything from blindness to insanity, and they promoted various treatments to prevent it. Some of these treatments included everything from physical restraints to circumcision, and even surgical procedures designed to stop men from indulging in self-pleasure. It's hard to imagine how widespread and deeply ingrained these fears were, and how many lives were affected by them. Historians still debate the extent to which these medical beliefs influenced Victorian society, but there's no denying that they were an essential part of the broader moral panic. The medical profession had a powerful influence on how sex was perceived, and many people trusted doctors implicitly, believing their recommendations to be authoritative. In many cases, these recommendations were grounded more in social control than actual science. It wasn't just physical treatments that shaped Victorian attitudes towards sex. It was also the increasing medicalization of sexual pleasure. Doctors sought to regulate and define what was normal and acceptable when it came to human sexuality. Their influence extended far beyond the clinical setting, as they wrote books, pamphlets, and articles that contributed to the public discourse on sexuality. These writings reinforced the idea that sexual pleasure was dangerous and, in some cases, outright immoral. This contributed to the sense of shame that many Victorians felt about their own bodies and desires. This obsession with regulation and control affected people in ways that we can still feel today. The idea that certain forms of sexuality are unnatural or immoral continues to shape modern views on sex and relationships. The idea that sex is dirty, shameful, or sinful still persists in many societies, despite the progress made in sexual liberation and education. One of the most troubling aspects of the Victorian sexual code was the way it enforced silence. People were not encouraged to talk openly about their desires, their sexual needs, or their emotions. This left many people, especially women, in the dark about their own bodies and sexual health. Women, in particular, were left to fend for themselves, without guidance or support. In fact, the silence around sexual education was so pervasive that many Victorians went their entire lives without truly understanding their own bodies or the nature of their sexual relationships. The consequences of this silence were far-reaching. People, especially women, often lived in ignorance about their own bodies, suffering in silence with physical and emotional pain that could have been easily avoided. Women were told to repress their desires, and those who didn't were seen as deviant or immoral. This created a culture of shame and guilt, where people were too afraid to talk openly about their needs or desires. Repression of sex in the Victorian era wasn't just a personal issue, it was a social and political one. It shaped how people interacted with each other, how they viewed themselves, and how they saw the world. The repression of sexuality was about much more than just controlling desire. It was about controlling power, authority, and social order. In many ways, it was a tool used to maintain control over society as a whole. By the end of the Victorian era, these attitudes had begun to shift. The early 20th century saw the rise of sexology and the beginnings of more open conversations about sexuality. However, the legacy of Victorian sexual repression would continue to shape how sex was viewed in the modern world. And so, as you lie awake thinking about the restrictions, the hidden desires, and the fears of the Victorian era, it becomes clear. Their world wasn't just one of repression. It was one of confusion, pain, and silence. It was a world where sexual pleasure was seen as a dangerous force, one that had to be controlled at all costs. Now that we've explored the overwhelming control over sexual expression in the Victorian world, it's essential to delve into the societal structures that allowed this repression to thrive. The Victorian era's moral code wasn't just an abstract set of ideas. It was deeply ingrained in the laws, cultural norms, and practices of the time. The fear of sex and sexuality was not only regulated by medical professionals and religious leaders, but also by a system of legal and institutional practices that sought to control and restrict human desire. One of the most fascinating and disturbing facets of this control was the way it played out in the realm of legal and social justice. In the Victorian era, the law was deeply involved in regulating sexuality. For instance, laws against unnatural sexual acts, such as sodomy and masturbation, were strictly enforced. These laws didn't just penalize actions, they criminalized desire itself, creating a culture of surveillance where citizens were constantly wary of stepping out of line. One of the most infamous examples of this legal intrusion was the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act in the UK, which made gross indecency between men a criminal offence. This law was particularly devastating for the LGBTQ+ community, criminalizing not just actions but also relationships and identities. It wasn't just about the sexual act itself, but about defining what was acceptable and normal in the eyes of the law. Any behavior that deviated from the heterosexual, procreative ideal was punished, and often harshly. But the Victorian legal system didn't just regulate homosexuality, it also had a profound effect on women's sexuality, particularly in relation to marriage and reproduction. Women were considered the property of their husbands, and their sexuality was not their own to control. Marriage wasn't just about emotional connection, it was about social obligation. Women had no legal right to refuse their husband's sexual advances, and to do so was considered not only a breach of marital duty, but also a violation of societal norms. In fact, marital rape was not legally recognized as a crime until the 20th century, which means that for much of the Victorian era, a woman had no legal recourse if her husband forced himself upon her. In a society that viewed a woman's duty as being the bearer of children, her body became a vessel for reproduction rather than a place for self-expression or personal pleasure. The laws and norms that governed this system were designed to maintain control over women's sexuality and ensure that the only legitimate form of sexual activity occurred within the confines of marriage. As much as the legal system sought to regulate sex, it also sought to maintain a very specific narrative about sexuality. Marriage was often framed as the ultimate fulfillment of a woman's life. To be unmarried or childless was to be an anomaly, an outsider to the very structure of society. Women were taught from an early age that their worth was tied to their sexual availability within marriage, and that they must maintain their chastity until they were handed off to a man who would become their husband. This gendered dynamic was enforced by a system of laws, social customs, and cultural expectations that left little room for women to step outside their prescribed roles. Interestingly, while women's sexual behavior was controlled and confined, there was also a simultaneous glorification of their virginity. Virginity was seen as the ultimate symbol of purity and worth, and women who lost their virginity outside of marriage were stigmatized as fallen women. This concept of virginity as an ideal not only controlled women's sexual lives, but also made them commodities within the marriage market. The idea of a woman being pure until marriage made her more valuable to prospective husbands, who sought to maintain the illusion of innocence in their new wives. This focus on virginity created a sense of anxiety, particularly for young women, who were often raised to believe that their entire value rested on maintaining their purity. For men, this expectation was less clear-cut. While men were expected to uphold the idea of chastity until marriage, they were also encouraged to prove their masculinity and sexual prowess. This pressure led to a complicated double standard. Men were allowed a certain degree of freedom and indulgence, while women's sexuality was tightly monitored and controlled. Despite the intense social pressure placed on women, some did try to escape these boundaries. The emergence of fallen women, women who had sex outside of marriage or engaged in sex work, provided a glimpse into the darker side of Victorian sexual repression. Prostitutes, while vilified by society, were often the subject of fascination, and some women found themselves trapped in this system, unable to escape the pressures of economic necessity. Victorian society also created a complex relationship between sexuality and class. While the upper classes were able to indulge in private affairs, the working classes often had little choice but to rely on the limited sexual freedoms afforded to them in brothels or clandestine relationships. Class was a determining factor in how people navigated the complex web of sexual repression, and for the poor, their bodies were often commodified for the sake of survival. As much as the Victorians attempted to create a rigid structure of sexual norms, they were also creating a space where desire could not be entirely suppressed. The very laws that sought to protect their sense of sexual order became the catalyst for rebellion, secrecy, and rebellion. The system that the Victorians built was one of tension and contradiction. On one side, they attempted to control human desire, and on the other, they set the stage for the very sexual liberation movements that would eventually emerge in the 20th century. Historians still argue whether Victorian society's views on sexuality were solely oppressive, or whether they inadvertently created an environment where subversive ideas about sexual freedom could take root. While much of the discourse was designed to keep people in check, it's clear that the Victorian world was a world of intense complexity. Despite the moral codes, sexual repression, and cultural pressures, sexual liberation found a way to seep through the cracks. As you reflect on the iron grip of Victorian morality, it's essential to understand that these ideas didn't disappear with the dawn of the 20th century. The shadows of Victorian repression still shape modern attitudes towards sex, even as we fight to break free from these constraints. Sexuality, once a hidden and forbidden topic, is now something we can explore more openly. But the deep-seated fear, shame, and guilt that were passed down through generations are still deeply embedded in our culture. As we move forward, we'll uncover more of the lingering impacts of Victorian sexuality and explore how these repressive attitudes influenced later social movements. The journey from the Victorian era to modern-day sexual liberation is one of resistance, transformation, and ultimately freedom. As we continue this exploration of the terrifying realities of sex in the Victorian era, it's crucial to understand the long-lasting impacts of the era's sexual repression on later generations. The Victorians didn't just shape their own world, they built a foundation that would influence how sex was viewed for centuries to come. Though the sexual revolution of the 1960s challenged these outdated norms, the seeds of Victorian sexual mores remained deeply entrenched in Western culture. In the years following the Victorian period, society gradually began to loosen the strict controls over sex. But it wasn't an overnight shift. The early 20th century was a time of experimentation and reform, but it also saw the rise of movements that sought to reassert Victorian ideals. One of the most significant events in this shift was the rise of the suffragette movement, where women began to demand more control over their lives, their bodies, and their sexuality. Women, who had long been regarded as mere vessels of reproduction, started to fight for the right to be sexual beings, with autonomy and choice. However, even as women fought for sexual freedom, the cultural and social norms of the Victorian era continued to haunt them. The Victorian ideal of the pure woman had become ingrained in society's collective consciousness. This ideal became an obstacle in the fight for women's rights, as it was tied to ideas of virtue and moral superiority. Women who embraced their sexual desires often faced backlash from both men and women, who viewed them as fallen or immoral. The fear of sexual promiscuity persisted, and the desire for sexual freedom was often met with harsh judgment and scorn. This judgment was also deeply rooted in the medical field. As society became more aware of women's sexual desires, the medical community tried to control and pathologize female sexuality, often framing any deviation from the norm as an illness or mental disorder. The 19th century views on female sexuality laid the groundwork for later psychological disorders like frigidity and hysteria, both of which were often used to describe women who did not conform to the ideal of chastity. These terms were used to justify the treatment of women's sexual autonomy as something to be fixed or corrected, often through methods that could only be described as invasive or cruel. Interestingly, the lingering effects of Victorian ideas about sex weren't just limited to women. Men too were often trapped by the stringent expectations placed upon them. The emphasis on male virility and sexual prowess during the Victorian era left many men struggling with issues like sexual performance anxiety and guilt over their desires. For men, sexual desire was often reduced to an act of duty, and pleasure was not the goal. The patriarchal structure of Victorian society demanded that men suppress any emotional connection to their sexual experiences, which created a toxic culture of emotional isolation. As a result, men were forced to navigate their desires in secret, fearful of being seen as anything less than the ideal of masculinity. The link between Victorian repression and early 20th century attitudes towards sex can also be seen in the rise of sexual health movements that emerged in the 1000s, 920s, and 1930s. As society began to shift toward a more open attitude towards sex, the sexual health movement aimed to educate individuals about safe sex practices and sexual wellness. Still, much of the sexual discourse remained grounded in the same Victorian principles that sought to control human desire. The push for sexual freedom was often coupled with a desire to maintain respectability, which created a tension between individual liberty and social norms. This tension continued to shape discussions about sex well into the mid-20th century. Despite the significant shifts that occurred in the 1960s and beyond, the shadows of Victorian sexual repression still loom large. The idea that sex is something that must be controlled, hidden, or regulated persists in many aspects of modern society. While we have made progress in terms of sexual liberation, we are still grappling with the long-standing cultural legacy of Victorianism. It's evident in the ways in which we view gender, sexuality, and relationships. The notion that sex is something shameful, or that it exists only within a narrow set of boundaries, continues to create a climate of fear, especially for those whose sexualities deviate from the mainstream. Moreover, the Victorian era's obsession with the body as a site of shame continues to shape how we view our own bodies. In the modern world, body image issues remain rampant, with people constantly bombarded by messages about what constitutes an ideal body. The Victorian ideal of the pure woman, whose body was only to be used for procreation, still echoes in the way we talk about women's bodies today. Women are still often valued based on their ability to conform to an idealized version of femininity, and their worth is frequently tied to their sexual purity. The Victorian era's influence on our understanding of sex and sexuality can also be seen in the ways we still view relationships today. The societal belief that marriage is the ultimate expression of love and sex as a duty rather than a mutual exchange of pleasure continues to inform how we view relationships. In many cultures, the idea that marriage and sex are tied to procreation and that intimacy should be devoid of passion is still prevalent. While we've come a long way in terms of accepting and celebrating sexual diversity, we must remember that the foundation of sexual repression, laid by the Victorians, continues to affect how we view sex, gender, and intimacy. In many ways, we are still living in the wake of their anxieties, fears, and judgments. The journey towards sexual freedom is not a straightforward one, and we must continue to confront the remnants of this past to truly embrace a future where all sexual expressions are respected and celebrated. One of the most poignant aspects of the Victorian era's sexual repression was the way it influenced future generations of women. For those who came after, the repression of their sexual desires became a symbol of social virtue, but it also created immense internal conflict. Many women internalized the shame associated with sexual pleasure and felt guilty for seeking any kind of sexual release. This generational trauma left deep scars that can still be seen in today's society, as many women still face difficulty in accepting their sexuality without judgment. As we continue to move forward, it's important to reflect on how far we've come and how much further we need to go. The sexual liberation movements of the 1960s were a powerful response to the repressive culture of the Victorian era, but the journey is ongoing. Understanding where we've been and how Victorian ideas about sex and power shaped the world around us is an essential part of the process. Only by confronting this dark history can we continue to break free from its lingering grip. The Victorian obsession with controlling sex and sexuality has shaped many aspects of our modern lives, but in the end, the most terrifying reality of the Victorian era wasn't just the laws, the medical practices, or the moral codes. It was the insidious way in which sexuality was turned into something to be feared, controlled, and silenced. This fear still echoes today, reminding us that the journey towards sexual freedom is a continuous one, and we must work to ensure that the lessons of the past never hold us back again. As we delve further into the terrifying realities of sex in the Victorian era, we must also examine how these repressive attitudes towards sexuality were not only culturally and legally enforced, but also perpetuated by religious ideologies. The Victorians were deeply influenced by a form of Protestant Christianity that tightly bound ideas of morality, virtue, and sexuality. The Church, which held tremendous sway over daily life, was perhaps the most influential institution in shaping sexual behavior during this time. For the Victorians, religion and sexuality were intrinsically linked. The Church, particularly the Anglican Church in England, provided clear guidelines on how people should conduct themselves sexually. These teachings emphasized sexual purity, chastity, and the importance of marriage as the only acceptable context for sexual activity. For women, the idea of sexual purity was especially crucial. Their value was directly tied to their virginity, and sexual transgression was seen as a moral failing. The Victorians believed that sexual desire was inherently sinful and had to be suppressed. Any indulgence in sex outside of marriage was seen as a transgression not just against social norms, but against God himself. In this moral framework, even natural biological urges were to be controlled. It was considered a Christian duty to refrain from sexual pleasure unless it served the ultimate purpose of procreation. This religious view reinforced the sexual repression of the time and added a layer of spiritual guilt to the already existing social and moral constraints. For men, the pressure to remain sexually restrained was less stringent than it was for women, but it was still present. Men were expected to refrain from excesses, but were allowed a certain amount of sexual liberty, particularly in the context of marriage. However, men who engaged in sexual activities outside the bounds of heterosexual marriage were often demonized, particularly if their actions threatened the social order. This created a complicated set of rules for male behavior, where they were expected to be sexually active, but were equally expected to control their desires and never let their lust take control. Yet the religious institution didn't only deal with the sanctity of marriage and sexual purity, it also created a culture of sexual shame, particularly around the female body. Women were constantly reminded of their responsibility to uphold moral integrity, and any expression of their sexuality outside of the confines of marriage was condemned. This belief was deeply rooted in biblical teachings about women's subjugation, with references to the idea of women being inherently sinful and needing the guidance of men to protect them from their own desires. The way women's sexuality was viewed by the church shaped their entire identity, and they were often left feeling powerless to express their desires openly. One of the most insidious aspects of the Victorian religious framework was how it extended into the realm of sexual education. For women, sexual education was essentially non-existent. Girls were raised to believe that their bodies were shameful, that any expression of sexual desire was sinful, and that sex was something to endure for the sake of marriage and procreation. For men, sexual education was more about control and duty, learning how to fulfill the expectations of marriage without succumbing to lust or passion. The lack of true sexual education left many Victorians confused and misinformed about their own bodies and desires. Historians still debate the influence of the Church in shaping the sexual ideologies of the time. Some argue that the religious repression of sexuality helped create a more ordered society, while others suggest that it was a form of social control used to keep the lower classes in check and ensure the continued dominance of the upper classes. Regardless of the intention, the legacy of Victorian religious teachings is clear. It created an environment where shame, guilt, and repression were the dominant forces in the understanding of sex. The legacy of the Victorian religious approach to sex continued to shape sexual norms well into the 20th century. Even as society began to loosen its grip on sexual restrictions, the moral teachings of the Victorian era lingered, leaving people conflicted about their desires and sexual behaviors. The notion of sexual purity and the idea of women's bodies being inherently sinful remained entrenched in many cultures, affecting everything from legal systems to personal relationships. In fact, much of the shame and guilt that we still associate with sex today can be traced back to these Victorian moral and religious teachings. The intense focus on female purity and the strict gender roles that were enforced during this time still reverberate in the way we talk about and experience sex. Women, in particular, continue to be taught to view their sexuality with suspicion, while men are often expected to embrace their sexual desires without any emotional or moral consideration. Despite the advancements made in the 20th century, the Victorians' control over sexuality has had lasting effects on societal attitudes towards sex, particularly in relation to gender. The way men and women are taught to view their desires, whether they are shamed or celebrated, has its roots in the Victorian world. Even today, many people still struggle to reconcile their sexual desires with societal expectations. This dissonance between personal desire and cultural norms is a direct result of the rigid sexual code that the Victorians imposed on their society. For many, the journey towards sexual liberation has been a long and difficult one, shaped by centuries of moral, religious, and social repression. While we have made significant strides in terms of accepting diverse sexualities and behaviors, the shadow of Victorian sexual repression remains a powerful force. This long-lasting influence means that discussions about sex, love, and desire are still fraught with tension and discomfort. It is clear that the Victorian approach to sexuality, with its strict boundaries and moral judgments, will continue to affect how we view sex for generations to come. As we move forward in our exploration, we'll examine the gradual shifts that began to take place in the early 20th century, particularly in the wake of the suffragette movement and the changing views on marriage and sexual relations. These shifts marked the beginning of a much-needed conversation about sexual health, autonomy, and liberation, but, as we'll see, the road to sexual freedom was fraught with obstacles, and the legacy of the Victorians' moral teachings would be a constant challenge. Now that we've examined the impact of religious and legal repression on Victorian sexuality, it's time to look at how the social structure itself contributed to the overwhelming fear of sex. The Victorian era was not just a time of sexual control. It was a time when sexuality became an instrument of social power, class distinction, and control. This led to a world where sex was tied to social status, with individuals of different classes facing vastly different experiences when it came to sexual freedoms and restrictions. Sex for the Victorians was not just about pleasure, it was a tool for maintaining societal order. The upper class, with their wealth and power, could afford to engage in discreet affairs, often with little consequence, while the lower classes were subjected to a far more rigid and moralistic standard. The fear of sexual expression was in many ways tied to the preservation of class structures. The idea was that sexual liberation or indulgence in any form was a threat to the social hierarchy, and if the lower classes were allowed to express themselves sexually, it would disrupt the existing order. For the upper classes, sex was often a private matter, carefully hidden from the public eye. It was an affair behind closed doors, one that was shrouded in secrecy, and the key to maintaining control over these relationships was keeping them discreet. For many upper-class men, The act of engaging in extramarital affairs was not just about physical pleasure. It was about asserting dominance over their own lives, asserting their power outside of the societal confines that were placed on them. This often led to a highly compartmentalized life. On the surface, they adhered to the Victorian ideals of marriage and chastity, but privately they indulged in relationships outside of the marriage bed. For women, however, sex was far more complex. Women were expected to maintain their purity and modesty, to preserve their social value and virtue for their husbands. Once married, however, their sexuality was no longer considered to be their own. It was owned by their husbands, a process that, in the eyes of society, reinforced the patriarchal structures of control. Women were not supposed to express sexual desire. They were expected to endure sexual acts for the purpose of procreation, and any pleasure they derived was seen as secondary or even sinful. This created a dichotomy where women's bodies were simultaneously revered and controlled, where their purity was seen as both a source of pride and an instrument of control. In this tightly controlled society, sex became a reflection of one's place in the social order. The wealthy and powerful were allowed to engage in private affairs that they could keep hidden, while those in the lower classes were subjected to far harsher scrutiny. Prostitutes, for instance, were often ostracized and demonized, yet they were also a vital part of the social fabric. The sexual liberation of the lower classes was seen as dangerous, an indicator that social norms were breaking down and that the class hierarchy might be undermined. For the lower classes, sex was not just about survival or pleasure. It was tied to the social structures that kept them oppressed. This dynamic is clearly seen in the way sexual services were commodified. Prostitution was rampant, and it was largely accepted as a fact of life, particularly for the lower classes. While the upper classes could afford to indulge in secret affairs, it was the working-class women who were often forced into the sex trade, where they had no choice but to sell their bodies for survival. The Victorian era's view of sexual morality was deeply tied to economic realities. Women who were poor and unmarried had few options but to resort to prostitution, and yet these women were viewed with contempt and disdain, as though their poverty and lack of choices made them morally inferior. The commodification of sex, however, was not only restricted to prostitution. Women, particularly from the upper classes, were expected to marry well and secure their futures through their husbands. Their social worth was tied to their sexual purity and ability to produce heirs, which reinforced the view of women's bodies as both property and instruments of class preservation. The notion that a woman's body was only valuable when controlled by her husband or male relatives contributed to the dehumanization of women, reducing them to mere vessels for carrying out societal expectations. The concept of the fallen woman emerged as a result of these deeply entrenched class divisions. Women who deviated from the prescribed norms of chastity, often due to financial necessity, were viewed as morally inferior, even though they were often forced into these positions by circumstances beyond their control. These women were not only excluded from respectable society, they were demonized for their supposed moral failures. In contrast, upper-class women, even those who had extramarital affairs, were often able to maintain their position within society, as their status was seen as more important than their personal behavior. In Munevive, At the same time, men were given more leeway to indulge their sexual desires, as long as it didn't threaten their ability to fulfill their societal roles. The idea of masculinity during the Victorian era was heavily tied to sexual prowess, but it was equally important that men demonstrate control over their desires. The paradox of male sexuality was that men were expected to be both sexually powerful and emotionally distant. Any failure to adhere to these expectations could result in social disgrace, particularly for those who were unable to perform sexually. Victorian masculinity, therefore, was based on a delicate balance of desire and control, and those who couldn't maintain it risked losing their place in the social hierarchy. The way sex was viewed in Victorian society was undeniably shaped by the complex intersection of class, gender, and power. These relationships defined how people understood their roles within society, and those who didn't fit neatly into these roles were marginalized. Women were expected to remain chaste, men were expected to be strong and capable, and anyone who failed to meet these expectations was subject to moral and social censure. It's clear that the Victorian era was a time of complex contradictions when it came to sex. The wealthy, particularly men, could indulge in sexual freedom, albeit within tight boundaries. The poor, especially women, had little to no sexual autonomy, and their value was defined by their ability to conform to societal expectations. This rigid structure created a society where sex was both a private indulgence and a public battleground for power. Historians still argue over whether this strict regulation of sex was a necessary component of Victorian social order, or if it was simply an oppressive tool used by the ruling classes to maintain control over the lower classes. What is clear is that the effects of these attitudes towards sex were far-reaching, shaping not only the lives of Victorians, but also the societies that followed them. As we move into the modern era, the legacy of Victorian sexual repression can still be seen in the ways we navigate class, gender, and sexuality. Though the laws and social norms have evolved, the deep-seated fear of sex and its potential consequences continues to shape our views. The battle for sexual autonomy and liberation is far from over, and the lessons of the Victorian era remain relevant today. As we continue to peel back the layers of Victorian sexual repression, it's vital to understand how these repressive norms weren't just ingrained in the upper echelons of society, but were woven deeply into the fabric of popular culture. The Victorians might have presented themselves as paragons of virtue, but beneath the surface, their sexual desires, contradictions, and fantasies became the very foundation of much of the era's literature, art, and public discourse. This cultural production both reflected and reinforced the era's sexual codes, creating a complex relationship between public morality and private indulgence. One of the most obvious manifestations of Victorian sexual repression in culture was in the genre of literature. Victorian novels, particularly those written by authors like Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, and the Bronte sisters, often dealt with themes of sexual morality, guilt, and repression. These novels served as a form of social control, warning readers about the dangers of excess or deviation from the sexual norms of the time, but they also unintentionally reflected the tension between the outward appearance of propriety and the underlying currents of desire that could not be fully suppressed. The portrayal of women in these novels was particularly telling. Women, often depicted as the moral center of the family, were consistently linked to notions of purity, chastity, and sexual restraint. This created a cultural ideal that women should be the gatekeepers of sexual morality, and those who stepped outside of this narrow definition were often punished or ostracized. The tragic heroines of many Victorian novels, such as Tess D'Urberfield in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or the female characters in Bronte's Jane Eyre, represented women whose sexual transgressions, whether real or perceived, led to their downfall. These novels weren't simply literary exercises. They were part of a larger cultural narrative that sought to reinforce the importance of sexual purity and restraint. The portrayal of women as moral paragons became so ingrained in the culture that even the smallest hint of sexual impropriety was enough to ruin a woman's reputation. Victorian society was fascinated by the duality of womanhood, the pure, chaste woman versus the fallen woman, a dichotomy that both fascinated and terrified the public. The more the Victorians attempted to suppress sexual expression, the more it became the subject of public gossip, scandal, and fascination. At the same time, the rise of the gentleman as an ideal of male behavior during the Victorian era placed considerable pressure on men to balance sexual dominance with moral restraint. The Victorian ideal of masculinity was tied not just to sexual performance, but also to control, dominance, and emotional detachment. A man was expected to be sexually active and capable of satisfying his wife, but he was also required to be emotionally reserved and authoritative. This ideal of manliness made emotional vulnerability, especially in the context of sex, unacceptable. Men were expected to remain aloof, emotionally distant, and in control. But these same ideals also created immense pressure, leading to a culture where male desire was both normalized and shamed. Interestingly, while literature and art of the time reflected these ideals of sexual purity, the reality of Victorian sexual life was often far more complex. Prostitution, an accepted but hidden part of Victorian society, played a critical role in the sexual economy of the time. Despite the public condemnation of prostitution, it was a ubiquitous feature of urban life in Victorian England, providing sexual release for men who were restricted by the norms of marriage. In fact, many Victorians, especially those in the upper and middle classes, frequented brothels as a way of maintaining their public reputations while satisfying their sexual needs in private. This contradiction between public morality and private indulgence was also reflected in the ways in which sexual health and disease were treated. The rise of sexually transmitted infections like syphilis became a major public concern during the Victorian era. While these diseases were often linked to the lower classes and prostitution, they were also widespread among the upper classes, who were more likely to have extramarital affairs. Syphilis in particular was viewed as a symbol of moral decay, an affliction that was both physical and metaphorical. Men in the upper classes who contracted the disease were often able to hide their affliction, while women, who were perceived as the moral barometers of society, faced much harsher consequences. Sexual health became an important concern for the medical community, with doctors developing various treatments, many of which were more about maintaining social order than actually curing diseases. For example, the widespread use of mercury and arsenic in treating syphilis was both dangerous and ineffective. But these treatments continued to be used because they fit into the larger moral framework of sexual punishment. Doctors and medical professionals, many of whom were influenced by Victorian moralism, treated sexual disease as a punishment for immoral behavior, further reinforcing the idea that sex was inherently shameful. The era's fixation on sexual purity also had a profound impact on sexual education, or the lack thereof. Victorian children, especially girls, were taught that their bodies were vessels of temptation and shame. Rather than receiving open, honest education about sex, they were taught to repress their desires and avoid anything that might suggest sexual curiosity. Young girls were often told that any expression of sexual desire, even curiosity, was sinful and shameful. The complete absence of proper sexual education left many people with a sense of confusion and guilt about their own bodies. For girls particularly, the lack of education often meant they were ill prepared for marriage or motherhood, and in many cases were left to figure out their own sexual experiences in the shadows, unaware of the true nature of their bodies and desires. Even as the Victorians tried to maintain their rigid moral codes, the cracks in this repressive system began to show. The contradictions between public morality and private indulgence led to a burgeoning underground culture of sexual rebellion. The sexual liberation movements that arose in the early 20th century were born out of the tension between the Victorian moral codes and the reality of human desire. The shift from sexual repression to liberation was neither immediate nor smooth, but it marked the beginning of a long struggle for sexual autonomy that continues to this day. As we look back on the Victorian era, it's easy to see how these deeply entrenched sexual norms still influence us today. The cultural repression of sex, the rigid gender roles, and the moralistic view of sexuality created a complex web of desire, guilt, and control that continues to affect our understanding of sex and relationships. The legacy of the Victorian era is still felt in modern society, in everything from our views on sexual health and gender roles to the ongoing fight for sexual freedom and equality. Despite the progress that has been made in the realm of sexual liberation, the echoes of Victorian sexual repression still reverberate through the fabric of our culture. Historians continue to debate how much the Victorian era influenced the sexual norms of later generations, but what's clear is that the era's complex relationship with sex laid the groundwork for many of the struggles and breakthroughs that followed. The tension between repression and rebellion during this period set the stage for the sexual revolutions of the 20th century, and it's that same tension that shapes the ongoing conversation about sex and morality today. As we continue to dissect the Victorian era's repressive sexual norms, we must also turn our attention to the hidden world of sexual pleasure and desire that existed beneath the surface. While society's public face presented an ideal of chastity, purity, and sexual restraint, the truth was far more complex. Despite the stifling atmosphere of sexual repression, the Victorians were also deeply fascinated by, and often consumed by, sexuality, desire, and the various ways in which these forces manifested themselves behind closed doors. One of the most intriguing aspects of this hidden world was the role of sexual fantasy in the lives of the Victorians. Even though public discussions about sex were seen as improper and immoral, individuals still harbored intense and often taboo desires. The very act of repression created a space where fantasies could thrive in the shadows. For many, these fantasies became an outlet for their repressed desires, and they played a critical role in how Victorians coped with the constant tension between their public and private selves. One area where these fantasies played out was in the realm of sexual literature. While works such as the Divine Comedy or Paradise Lost were celebrated for their religious and moral content, many Victorians were secretly consuming erotica, works that were filled with explicit taboo subjects. These underground texts provided a way for people to explore their sexual desires without facing the judgment or condemnation of society. They also served as a form of resistance to the moral codes that sought to suppress sexual expression. Erotic literature was in fact a vital part of the Victorian underground. Books, pamphlets, and illustrations that detailed sexual experiences, often in lurid and exaggerated ways, circulated clandestinely among the wealthy. These works typically explored forbidden subjects like adultery, same-sex relationships, and incest, subjects that were widely considered taboo and morally reprehensible by the mainstream society of the time. Though these works were often banned, the sheer number of them that were produced and distributed indicates how much demand there was for such material. One of the most famous examples of this clandestine literary culture was the work of the Marquis de Sade, whose writings, filled with violent and depraved sexual acts, shocked Victorian sensibilities. While these works were not widely published during the era, they found their way into private collections and were read by many who were intrigued by their defiance of societal norm. De Sade's work in particular highlighted the darker side of human sexuality, a side that Victorian society tried to suppress but was nonetheless fascinated by. His writings provided a release for those who were consumed by fantasies of power, dominance, and submission. While literature provided an outlet for sexual fantasy, another key area of Victorian life where desire manifested itself was in the world of the sexual body. The Victorian obsession with the ideal female form, slender waists, full hips, corseted figures, was not just about beauty, it was also about sexual control. For women, maintaining the appearance of a pure and restrained body became an essential part of their role in society. At the same time, these physical ideals also spoke to the cultural and sexual desires that were hidden behind the rigid facade of morality. Corsetry, for instance, was not just a fashion statement, it was a physical manifestation of the control that women's bodies were subject to. The tightness of the corset represented the suffocating control that society placed on women's sexuality. While corsets were designed to create an exaggerated hourglass figure, they also symbolized how the feminine body was constrained by Victorian ideals of beauty and modesty. The obsession with these tight-fitting garments was a way to shape women's sexuality to fit into the narrowly defined roles society had created for them. Ironically, the tighter the corset, the more women were forced to repress their natural bodily desires and instincts. At the same time, however, the corset also sparked sexual fantasies. The very act of binding a woman's body in a constricting garment created a sense of control and restriction that was inherently sexual. Many men were fascinated by the physicality of corsets and the way they made women's bodies appear to conform to an ideal. These garments became symbols of sexual desire in the private, forbidden world of Victorian fantasies, as they represented both the restraint and the allure of women's bodies. The way the Victorians viewed the sexual body was also deeply connected to the rising influence of the medical profession. As we discussed earlier, sexual health and disease became major topics of concern during the Victorian era. But beyond the medical concerns, sex became increasingly linked to the science of the body. The Victorians were obsessed with understanding how sex worked, not just for reproductive purposes, but for pleasure as well. Sexual behavior became a subject of study for doctors and psychologists who sought to understand the body's response to sexual activity. In fact, the Victorians were some of the first to attempt to classify and study different forms of sexual behavior. The medical profession, in its search for answers, often pathologized anything outside of the norm, categorizing certain sexual behaviors as diseases or disorders. The most notorious example of this was the medical profession's obsession with masturbation, where doctors believed that masturbation could lead to physical and mental illnesses, from blindness to insanity, and many treatments were designed to stop this sinful behavior. Ironically, this obsession with sexual health only served to reinforce the culture of repression. The more the Victorians tried to control sexual expression, the more they became obsessed with it. The medical and psychological exploration of sex only fueled the curiosity and desire that had been so tightly suppressed. While society maintained a facade of sexual propriety, there was a hidden, underground world of desire, fantasy, and exploration that flourished in the shadow. This hidden world of sexual desire wasn't confined to literature and physical appearance. It also manifested itself in the cultural obsession with sensuality and eroticism. Erotic paintings, sculptures, and photographs from the era often depicted sexual or sensual themes in ways that were meant to be provocative. Yet they were concealed under layers of artistic sophistication. These works, whether displayed in private homes or hidden away in collections, were a way for people to engage with their sexual desires without fear of social judgment. The sheer number of these works and the widespread fascination with eroticism shows that despite the era's outward restraint, the Victorians were far from sexually indifferent. But perhaps the most telling indication of the complexity of Victorian sexuality is the fact that, despite all the repression, the Victorians' sexual desires were never truly stifled. The era's fear of sex and sexual expression may have been overwhelming, but it couldn't completely extinguish the natural human desire for pleasure. In the end, the very act of repressing sexuality only gave it more power. And this paradox, where repression and desire exist in a constant, delicate balance, is one of the most enduring legacies of the Victorian era. As we conclude this section, it's important to reflect on the contradictory nature of Victorian sexuality. While the culture sought to repress and control sexual desires, it simultaneously created a fertile ground for sexual rebellion and subversion. The hidden world of fantasy, erotica, and sexual exploration that flourished during this time revealed that, no matter how hard the Victorians tried to control sex, they could never fully suppress it. The tension between repression and desire is still a defining feature of our own relationship with sex today. As we journey deeper into the sexual repression of the Victorian era, it's essential to explore the role that sex played in maintaining the rigid class distinctions that were such a defining feature of the period. The Victorian obsession with morality, virtue, and sexual purity was not only about controlling personal desire, it was a tool for preserving the social structure. Sex, or rather the control of sex, became a way of maintaining power over society's most vulnerable, the poor, the working class, and women. The fear of sex was tied to a fear of destabilizing the carefully constructed order that governed everyday life. In this class-conscious society, the upper classes and the working classes experienced sex and the punishment for sexual transgressions differently. For the wealthy, sex was something to be controlled and hidden, a private matter between husband and wife, often used to cement alliances or strengthen family legacy. Marriage was seen as the most important institution for the preservation of the family unit, and any deviation from this norm was seen as a threat to the very fabric of society. For women, marriage was their primary social value, and their sexuality was regulated in order to ensure that their purity was maintained until their marriage contract was fulfilled.